We're hearing more from those 9 hours of taped conversation between veteran reporter Bob Woodward and President Trump, conducted for Woodward's new book, Rage. The call took place on August 14th after more than 168,000 people died from the coronavirus. Here is some of that conversation as obtained by CNN. In it, Woodward warns President Trump he probably won't like some of the content that's being published.
What won't I like, Bob?
Well, just, there is, it's tough times. The virus, as you repeatedly told me and as you've said publicly, it's derailed things. And it's a big reality in people's lives, as you know. So I will get it to you. And
the market's coming back very strong. You do know that.
Yes, of course. And
Did you cover that in the book?
Yeah, oh, sure.
For more on the tapes, I'm joined by Zeke Miller and Jacquline Alemany. Zeke is a CBSN political contributor and White House reporter for the Associated Press. Jacquline is a political reporter and author of the Power Up newsletter for the Washington Post. Welcome to both of you. Great to have you both with us. Zeke, let me start with you. At the point of this conversation we're hearing today, Woodward's book was already off to the publisher. Yet President Trump is still, trying to sway him, talking about the strength of the stock market and telling him there was nothing else that could be done regarding the virus. But we know that's not true, correct?
Yeah, we know that if you line up the president's other comments to Bob Woodward with his public comments to the American public, they don't track. And this was a big subject of discussion last week and will probably be all the way until the election, is that the president was admittedly downplaying the potential hazards of the coronavirus pandemic to the American public, downplaying its potential effect to disrupt American life up until the moment in mid-March when it became impossible to ignore. And then even then, in April, was very quick to sort of shift toward reopening at a time when overruling the advice of many of his own scientific experts. The president's handling of this, we can see even just his campaign rally in Las Vegas with thousands of people indoors on Sunday night. So just another data point is sort of showing how the president's relationship with the coronavirus and what he says in public, what he does in public, what he says and thinks privately will be a factor all the way between now and Election Day.
And Jackie, the polls show us that most voters have already made up their minds about who they're going to vote for. Some are even already voting. So at the end of the day, do you think that these tapes are going to make any difference at the ballot box?
It's really impossible to say definitively, Tanya, but I do think the closer and closer we get to this election, each negative news cycle for this president sticks more and more. Although it is worth noting that there isn't much that does stick polling-wise to this president. He does have sort of a plateau in terms of polling amongst his most ardent supporters. That being said, as Zeke noted, this is something that is really top of mind and important to American voters. It's what Woodward told the president himself. There is a huge disconnect between the stock market and the American economy, as we've seen, with millions of Americans unemployed, almost 200,000 Americans dead. And now, in the president's own words, he's made it very clear that he purposefully downplayed the pandemic in order to prioritize his political imperatives, which was keeping the economy open. And as Zeke also very importantly noted, just look at the president's current actions. He's still currently downplaying the pandemic, holding a huge indoor rally, telling a reporter in Nevada last night that he's not worried about catching the coronavirus himself, even as Americans continue to die every single day. But look, the polling that we saw over the weekend shows that Trump's law and order messaging has yet to trump Americans' concerns in battleground states, at least, over the coronavirus pandemic and the havoc it's really wrought on Americans' lives from a health perspective to an economic and schooling and education perspective.
Yeah, it does seem to be trumping everything right now. And Zeke, the president has taken heat for more than a week about this downplaying of the virus, sort of, as you said, what he was saying publicly, not tracking with what he was saying privately. But over the weekend, he tried to shift some of that blame to Bob Woodward, saying, look, if it was such a big deal, he should have said something. Now, obviously, Woodward is a reporter and not the president of the United States. But that aside, should Woodward ethically have released some of this information more quickly?
The issue isn't what Bob Woodward knew and said, because even if Bob, it's not like the opinion that the coronavirus was a dangerous virus and it could have potential hazards, pose potential health hazards to Americans or people around the world. That wasn't unknown at the time the president was saying, and health officials at the CDC and other places across the government were making very much the same warnings. The issue was they never had the voice of the president, the bully pulpit, sort of the ultimate presidential megaphone behind it, telling people to listen, pay attention to what the doctors and the public health officials are saying. So there's an argument why maybe Bob Woodward could have released it earlier, but the bigger factor and the factor that will really affect things would have been what the president said and did, and that wouldn't have changed whether depending on the timetable.
Right, of course. But I'm just wondering whether if he had sounded the bullhorn at the time saying, look, the president is saying one thing publicly and another thing privately, perhaps it would have, one could wonder whether it would have forced the president to address that inconsistency earlier.
I think it's certainly possible. At the same time, though, there was, the contemporaneous accounting in the press, might not have had that great quote from the president saying he was purposely downplaying it. But, from our reporting, pretty much everyone's reporting at the time was that the president was doing just that. This was is kind of the cherry on top that sort of is the president in his own words. We're able to hear him sort of say those words. It's more of a political factor for the president than a policy one.
Absolutely. All right. And Jackie, one headline today seems to be the president saying nothing more could have been done. How is that likely to sit with voters?
We know that's just not true, especially as we're heading into the fall, the post-Labor Day period that people like Dr. Anthony Fauci and the president's top health advisors have warned about. As the virus continues to spread, especially into the Midwest, in states it previously really had not cropped up in, it's an indication that this virus is still spreading and that we are potentially in store for a very horrific winter. Many models, specifically the IMHE model that the White House has previously used to guide decision makings in the past, over the past 6 months, with regards to the coronavirus, projects that potentially double the amount of people could die this winter. So, look, it does matter. It matters that people wear masks at the president's indoor rallies, and it matters what the president continues to do, which includes, if he's not wearing a mask at these rallies that he continues to hold against the advice of public health officials who are guiding their decisions based off of the science and research. It's just not the case that it doesn't matter. It really does, and every little action could really save lives.
We heard that from a doctor earlier today. All right. Well, Zeke Miller and Jacquline Alemany, thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you.